Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you for joining us for this presentation about the modern religious architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone to please silence or turn off your cell phones. Also remember, bathrooms are a left out the door and another left down the hall. This June marks the 150th anniversary of Frank Lloyd Wright's birth. We are honored to have Professor Joseph Seary discuss the sacred spaces designed by this renowned architect. Joseph Seary is a professor of modern architectural history at Wesleyan University. In 2015, the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy gave him a Wright Spirit Award for his decades of scholarship on Wright's architecture. He has published numerous acclaimed books and articles about Wright. Please welcome Professor Seary.
Well, thank you, Emily. And this is a beautiful room. I mean, the air conditioning, the sound system. I was really impressed with the space. Thanks for inviting me. And I wanted to talk about this building first. This is Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois, which is just west of Chicago. And just yesterday, it reopened in its restored form after years of restoration. So that's one of the many events associated with Frank Lloyd Wright's 150th anniversary, and also the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York just opened, and I understand you're going to have a presentation or field trip related to that on Tuesday. So this is the season when Wright is getting a lot of attention. And thinking about Unity Temple first, though created for varied clients and in different settings, Frank Lloyd Wright's religious auditoriums share a common concern for mutual visibility and audibility to enhance the communal nature of worship. He was also attentive to the symbolic or figurative character of each of these projects, which were symbolically legible forms that represented their clients' particular denominational cultures. In his autobiography, Wright wrote, quote, "My religion, so far as it went, was Unitarian," unquote. And he claimed to descend from Unitarian ministers on both his father's and mother's sides, including on his father's side from Connecticut. After serving as an assistant in design in the firm of Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan in Chicago from 1887 and starting his independent practice in 1893, Wright's first commission for a major church was this one, Unity Temple, which still functions as the Unitarian Universalist Church in Oak Park, Illinois. And Wright began work on this building in the summer of 1905. Wright and his family had long been members of this congregation, whose earlier spired neo-Gothic building had burned down that spring. Unlike older Basilican churches with long naves, Unity Temple has a cubic auditorium only 35 feet wide between balcony fronts. But the room seats 450 in pews on the central floor and in lower and upper balconies around three sides of the room, all within intimate range of the frontal central pulpit and the organ screen behind. Wright called the building a modern meeting house in the tradition of New England meeting houses from colonial times, wherein everyone can see and hear each other while focused on the pulpit and choir. He designed clear-story windows on all four sides to light the room. In presenting Wright's design to Oak Park, where medievally styled churches of other Protestant denominations were the norm, Unity Temple's minister asserted that, quote, "without tower or spire, it expresses the spirit of the ideal. By its form, it expresses the thought, inherent in the liberal faith, that God should not be sought in the sky, but on earth among the children of men," unquote. In the spirit of Unitarian appreciation of world religions, Unity Temple's concrete exterior alluded to non-Western temples, including Japanese and Mayan works known to Wright. He went to Japan as his first trip abroad in 1905. As its minister wrote, quote, "informed by the same spirit which characterized the ancient temples, this structure typifies the thought that while religions are many, religion is one. The past and the present forms of religion are thus brought together in a spirit of unity," unquote. As in later religious structures, Wright here chose a distinct geometric figure. In Unity Temple, this is the square, developed as the cube, whose ratio of 1 to 1 to 1 of dimensions signified the Unitarian ideal of unity, as did the building's then novel monolithic construction in reinforced concrete, exposed inside and out. Wright did not build another church for 30 years. By that time, his religious architecture was closely related to his designs for theaters. His view of the modern theater as a temple for culturally elevated drama shaped his unbuilt theater projects for Woodstock, New York, 1931-32, and Hartford, Connecticut, not built, 1948-49, and then his built Kalita Humphreys Theater for the Dallas Theater Center of 1955-59. In these, Wright developed a plan for seating based on what he called the reflex angle, meaning groups of seats arranged at 30-degree angles around a frontal stage projecting into the audience. Wright used the reflex angle plan in this building, the Annie M. Pfeiffer Chapel for Florida Southern College in Lakeland, which was designed and built 1938-41, and then the Community Church in Kansas City, Missouri of 1939-42. Pfeiffer Chapel, built as both auditorium and chapel for President Lud Spivey's Liberal Methodist College, had a compact plan of reflex angles on a main floor and a balcony. The, quote, seating is so arranged that no one in the audience is more than 50 feet away from the rostrum, and everyone has a direct view of the speaker, unquote. The chapel's central skylit tower crowns an open cantilevered concrete construction. The democratic ideal in worship spaces informed the Reverend Burris Jenkins's community church in Kansas City, which had broken with the liberal disciples of Christ to adopt an open membership policy and to become the largest Protestant congregation in Kansas City with 4,200 members. When its earlier neo-medieval building burned in 1939, Wright was asked to design a new auditorium that could function as a theater or a cinema as well as a sanctuary, since this church aspired to be, quote, the social center for the masses, unquote. The design also included the reflex angle seating in a space spanned by steel beams and trusses to create a room uninterrupted by columns. Dedicated in January 1942, and this is a photograph from the time of the dedication, the community church with its exterior cantilevered balconies looked both modernistic and non-sectarian, conveying its minister's ideal of, quote, the church of the future, unquote. Conveying a democratic ideal through geometry was central to Wright's church building for the first Unitarian Society in Madison, Wisconsin. This was created in 1946-52. He called it a country church in the tradition of Unitarian rural chapels in the region that Wright had known since his boyhood, one of which he had helped to design on his mother's family's lands near his later home at Taliesin in southern Wisconsin, about 40 miles away. Wright's father, the Reverend William Russell Carey Wright, a Connecticut native, had been a founding member of the Madison Unitarian Society in the 1880s. Their new building marked its congregation's relocation to a then rural site across fields looking toward Lake Mendota in this direction. As the minister wrote to Wright, quote, we conceive the core to be one large room which will be usable for all the functions of a parish, calling for a large assembly room. That is, this room will be adaptable for worship, lectures, forums, recreations, dinners, movies, recitals, and dramatics, unquote. Wright shaped a concise triangular room that could be rearranged in front of its stone pulpit below the organ and choir loft. The space also embodied his ideal of democratic character and church architecture in its wood-roofed construction above its prow-like base of locally quarried limestone, mostly transported from the quarry by church members. Wright compared the roof shape to hands raised in prayer, recalling a canonical image of Albrecht Dürer, so the building shape, like Unity temples, was partly metaphorical. Throughout his career, Frank Lloyd Wright adapted earlier unbuilt projects to later executed buildings. In his unbuilt steel cathedral for New York City of 1927 and his realized Beth Shalom Synagogue of 1954-59 in Elkins Park, north of Philadelphia, Wright worked with two clients, the Episcopal Reverend William Norman Guthrie of the Church of St. Mark's in the Bowery in Manhattan, and at Beth Shalom, Rabbi Mortimer J. Cohen. Both were supremely well informed about religious architecture, and both were concerned to create buildings that would embody their visions of modern democratic worship. Guthrie, who had known Wright since 1908, when he had lectured in Oak Park, Illinois, and admired Wright's Unity Temple there, brought to his work with Wright a lifelong familiarity with European cathedrals and a deep knowledge of non-Western faiths, combined with the desire to create an American worship hall that would house rituals of what he called a universal religion for the diverse groups in New York City. The project, which was for a gigantic structure of steel and glass to be 2,400 feet tall in Manhattan, never advanced beyond the few surviving preliminary drawings, but the design informed Wright's scheme for Beth Shalom 30 years later. Founded in North Philadelphia in late 1918 and named House of Peace, and thanks for the armistice ending World War I, Beth Shalom was a conservative Jewish congregation that chose as its first rabbi Mortimer J. Cohen, who had known and admired Wright's work since 1917, when Cohen was a student in New York City. After his start at Beth Shalom in 1920, Cohen and his wife traveled to Europe and Palestine in 1927. After World War II, like many American Jewish urban congregations, Beth Shalom decided to follow its membership's move to the suburbs, where it purchased a site on Old York Road in Elkins Park, north of Philadelphia, building a school and a social center there in 1952, before Wright's building was realized nearby. Cohen urged his congregation to relocate their synagogue there, and he developed his ideas into a design consisting of his own sketches and an explanatory text that he shared with his friend, the sculptor Boris Bly, who urged that they be sent to Wright. Bly had been familiar with Wright's work at Florida Southern College in Lakeland, where Bly taught before coming to Philadelphia. As Wright's client and advocate for his building's realization in the 1950s, Cohen repeatedly evoked a balance of tradition and modernity that, in his view, distinguished conservative from Orthodox and Reform Judaism. Indeed, the conservative movement tended to define itself in terms of its distinctions from and affinities with the other two. In the post-war era, conservative Judaism styled itself as a middle-class American movement, distinct from Reform's roots in Germany and Orthodoxy's links to Eastern Europe. As Cohen wrote in 1939, quote, "Orthodox Judaism can be clearly portrayed. Its services are entirely in Hebrew, with possibly an occasional sermon in Yiddish, the complete separation of men and women in the synagogue, the men's heads covered, the prayer shawl or talith worn. Orthodox Judaism stands fixed in its gaze upon the past," unquote. By contrast with the Reform movement, Cohen said, quote, "The temple has left behind the shul, or the synagogue, and with that abandonment has left behind much that is characteristically Jewish. The large use of Hebrew in the service, that strong emphasis on intensive Jewish education so characteristically Jewish, many ceremonials and customs that enriched Jewish life and made it unique," unquote. Conservative congregations could vary from being almost like Orthodox to verging on Reform practices. Yet conservatives shared certain priorities. As Cohen described them, quote, "The major portion of the service is in Hebrew. The Torah is read on the Sabbath and holidays. Intensive Hebrew education is urged for boys and girls. Order and decorum are sought after and enforced. The traditional order of the prayers is adhered to so far as is possible, and Jewish customs and ceremonies are observed," unquote. Wright's Beth Shalom took shape near the peak of the conservative movement's national growth. In 1949, its national organization had included 365 congregations. By 1955, that number had risen to 520, with 269 more inducted from 1955 through 1961. Memberships also grew. This overall denominational growth coincided with the national shift to the suburbs after Beth Shalom's process of transition from North Philadelphia to Elkins Park, as one variant on a story that recurred in hundreds of cases in the post-war era. Soon after he contacted Wright in late 1953, Cohen sent Wright his sketches for a synagogue that would represent, quote, "the American spirit wedded to the ancient spirit of Israel," unquote. Like the steel cathedral, Beth Shalom was to be simultaneously futuristic and archaic. Cohen was also seeking a monument of national importance from the country's greatest living architect, whom he compared to Michelangelo at St. Peter's or Rennes at St. Paul's. And he wanted the building to represent Philadelphia as the beacon of American liberties. Following Dr. Joseph Hertz, who edited the first English language commentary on the Torah, Cohen focused on the idea of the tabernacle as a, quote, wandering Mount Sinai, unquote, the site where God had given Moses the Ten Commandments as the key foundation of Judaism. Thus, with his initial instructions to Wright in November 1953, Cohen sent Wright images of Mount Sinai, as we're seen on the right, showing the craggy summit in the desert, and also views of ancient, medieval, and early modern European synagogue interiors, and imaginings of Solomon's temple. From its rabbi's perspective, what was most important about Wright's building as the image of a moving Sinai was that its architecture invited veneration of the Torah housed within. The capacity of the art to focus attention on this core of the faith was, in Cohen's view, what made the building not a form of idolatry. Imaging Sinai to represent Torah would also make Wright's building distinctly Jewish, hence neither Christian nor Islamic. As Cohen reminded congregants, quote, Judaism is based on a document which states in law, history, custom, and ceremony a way of life. This document is the heart of the Bible, the Torah, unquote. Yet comparably important from a rabbinical perspective would be the idea of a moving Sinai, understood not just as a metaphor for Jewish diasporic migration, but as a symbol of the idea that Judaism as a religion is a continuing process of interpretation through the centuries. Hence, as Cohen wrote, quote, there is more than merely the written Torah. There is the oral Torah, which helps to interpret and apply the law to daily life in terms of the best wisdom of the day. Judaism is a religion that has great ideals and ideas, but is not an ideology. It grows by interpretation that is decided by learning, wisdom, and men of experience, unquote. This was an American Judaism based on the Torah, but it was also a religion of its place and time. Hence, Wright's building was to bridge symbolically between the biblical past and the modern American present. As his rhetoric implied, Cohen's interest in the ideal of an American synagogue was not only architectural, but was also a response to the Jewish post-war situation in the United States. He said at the groundbreaking that American Jews felt a spiritual bond with Israel, yet the European past could no longer serve as a primary point of reference. Instead, quote, American Jewry must now come into its own. It can no more face backward nor look across the seas. It must look into its own soul. It must find its meaning here in terms of American experience and American life, unquote. In Cohen's view, this was partly due to a generational change, since the nation's Jewish population was increasingly native-born. Hence, quote, our boys and girls raised without European memories of their own or of their parents, or indeed even of their grandparents, know European Jewish life no more. These boys and girls are native to this soil. They are native to this essence. We are facing, we Jews, a new thing, the American Jew of American ancestry, unquote. This represented a new challenge for, quote, will this American Jew, fully and richly American in the highest and best sense of the word, be a carrier of Judaism and its universal message to all men and to themselves? Here we enter into the realm of uncertainty. Here we need a great religious faith, unquote. Thus, Wright's building was to serve as a reminder to American-born Jews of their faith's origins. The more distant they were from their European roots, the more they needed to remember Sinai. Cohen's dual emphasis on the origins of the Jewish faith and its current American situation paralleled Wright's dual attitudes toward the project. One, his Unitarian-based appreciation of Judaism as a religion, and the other, his resounding commitment to an American national culture. As the historian Emily Cooperman has insightfully put it, quote, Rabbi Cohen's recontextualization of Jewish experience and religion within the broader American culture provided Wright a point of intellectual access for the project and appealed to the universal elements of spirituality that Wright embraced, unquote. Cohen also sent Wright as we're seeing on the left, a very rough sketch of Beth Shalom's interior. Cohen's sketch plan shows that he envisioned not a basilican nave, but an octagonally focused space with the rabbi democratically at the congregation's center. Historically, Orthodox synagogues had the central bima on a freestanding platform oriented so that those who lead the service or read the Torah face the ark. By contrast, Reformed congregations in the 19th century had favored the frontal pulpit and lectern facing the congregation and away from the ark behind. As historian Lee Weisbach has observed, quote, by orienting the prayer leader like other worshipers toward the Aron Kodesh, or the Holy Ark, and by often placing him literally in the midst of the congregation, the intention has been to engender an atmosphere of inclusion and participation. The message conveyed is that individuals are expected to involve themselves in the worship experience in much the same way as those leading services, unquote. What Cohen likely sought to do in the new Beth Shalom was to counter the decades-old trend among Reformed congregations of borrowing the typically Christian arrangement of raised frontal pulpits and the congregation in pews as an audience. As the prolific Reform synagogue architect Percival Goodman wrote in 1949, quote, to face all of the seats to the front of a sanctuary, as in a theater or lecture hall, is clearly an imitation of the Protestants, but it is quite inappropriate to the Jews, unquote. Some conservatives were not wholly comfortable with either the Orthodox central bima, which some saw as alien to American culture, or with the Reformed frontal bima, which some saw as too church-like. But Cohen's view was like that of Ismar Schorsch, later chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, who advised conservative congregations constructing new synagogues to, quote, consider a design that would restore the reading of the services and the Torah to the center of the sanctuary, unquote. In Wright's realized plan, the bima is on a platform that does project forward into the sanctuary so that it is partly flanked by seating rather than being either like a purely central bima or a frontal pulpit. In Wright's original design of March 1954, Cohen's octagon had become an irregular hexagon with the ark and the bima at the eastern end of the floor of seating sloping down toward them. In the interior, as Wright portrayed it, ambient daylight shines through a great glass tetrahedral dome, yet one whose geometry suggested not domes of Christian cathedrals, but the rugged, jagged profile of Mount Sinai. Among the original drawings, the most revealing of the scheme's essential ideas are the interior section on the left and the perspective on the right. The perspective bears Wright's handwritten legend. You can't read it from any distance, but it says, quote, American Synagogue for Beth Shalom. The drawing is a kind of sectional perspective from a fictive viewpoint behind the auditorium's uppermost rear seats. The drawing shows the worship room as a great tetrahedral glass pyramid, its central sections of glazing showing designs that might be rendered in colored glass. The vast sloped floor of seating in three sections, like a metaphor for uneven terrain, focused on the frontal arc as a huge faceted pylon faced with an ornamental design. As in the sketch section on the left, shooting up and out are rays of light from the Ner Tamid, or perpetual light above the Torah, housing the Ark of the Covenant as the center of spiritual energy. This towering room is accessible via ramps from the main entrance below, so that in rising up to the level of the Ark, worshippers would be replicating the idea of Moses' ascent of Mount Sinai to receive the law. This conservative theology stressed as divinity's revelation to Israel. This scheme of interior ascent is one of the most poignant and meaningful in all of Wright's public architecture, each time creating for the worshiper a spatial metaphor for the biblical encounter as the fundamental revelation. Cohen wrote, quote, I found in Mr. Wright a genuinely spiritual person who responded in his unique way to the great teachings of my religion, and he embodied Judaism in a simple, strong, and eloquent building that lifts up the soul and brings it closer to the God it worships. While on one level, Cohen argued for the universal import of Wright's design, and its transcendence of convention. It was also a building whose form could be read as recalling older Eastern European models. In 1954, Rachel Witschnitzer, who was then writing a history of synagogue architecture in the United States, first saw Wright's project for Beth Shalom, published in Time magazine in May. She wrote to the rabbi that she, quote, was very much impressed by the design, the concept of which was anticipated by those obscure Jewish carpenters in Poland and the Ukraine who built village synagogues on a square plan with step pyramidal roofs and a bima, of course, in the center. She soon wrote to Wright that she, quote, was amazed to see that your conception is very close to the wooden synagogues of the 17th and 18th century in Poland and the Ukraine. Unquote. She asked Wright, quote, have you ever seen reproductions of these structures, or have you come to the same solution because of the requirements of the plan? Unquote. According to one unpublished account, likely derived from information supplied by Cohen, the rabbi, quote, showed Mr. Wright a photograph of the synagogue at Gwoździce in Galicia, now in western Ukraine, which was in the shape of a mountain, unquote. Such a view appeared in George Lukomsky's Jewish Art in European Synagogues, a book of 1947, the same book from which Cohen sent Wright clippings of synagogue interiors. Believed to have been first built in the 17th century, this synagogue was one of the oldest extant in Poland and was well documented before its destruction in World War II. After Cohen received Wright's sketches, he, quote, was fearful lest the members of the board would not take easily to the imagery of the synagogue he projected. It was so very different than anything they'd ever seen or experienced. It was so very far out, unquote. In March 1954, Cohen invited Bly, the congregation's president, and the board of directors to his house to see Wright's 6 ink and pencil sketches mounted on an easel and at first covered with a cloth. When all had assembled, Cohen introduced Bly, who gave a brief talk about Wright and the nature of his architecture. Then, as the rabbi recalled, quote, I took over and explained that what they were about to see was something that they had never experienced before. I showed them pictures of the old synagogues of Poland with their succession of diminishing four-hipped roofs, unquote. Cohen identified one as the photograph of the 17th century timber synagogue at Gwoździce. Cohen then unveiled Wright's main sketch of the new Beth Shalom. He recalled, quote, my heart stood still until one member of the board, Raymond Perlman, exclaimed, a jewel, a jewel. With these blessed words, the fate of the design was settled. A flood of favorable exclamations filled the room. The directors were excited beyond words to express, and a spontaneous declaration of pledges began. In this design, Beth Shalom's leaders presumably recognized their own aspirations. Beth Shalom's enormous tetrahedral dome, whose span of about 120 feet was the largest that Wright realized in his lifetime, carried forward his experiments in a modern structural technique of steel-reinforced concrete and his lifelong study of the architectural potential of glass. Collaborating with Wright, Cohen found that, quote, he was working with a poet in building materials, unquote. Wright's studio at Taliesin in Wisconsin prepared working drawings from August 1954. These depended on resolving the engineering, which proved especially time-consuming for such a novel structure. The technical difficulty was compounded by the fact that Beth Shalom's geometry was not planned on a regular grid. As Taliesin apprentice Curtis Biesinger recalled, quote, part of the slowness and difficulty in doing the drawings for the synagogue stemmed from the fact that it was not designed on a unit system, as had been all of the other buildings by Mr. Wright on which I had worked. In the previous buildings, all dimensions were established by the unit system. Mr. Wright's first sketches for the synagogue and the subsequent development drawings and presentation drawings had not included a unit system, unquote. Why did Wright take an approach to designing Beth Shalom that was singular even within his own innovative oeuvre? Perhaps he wished to convey this synagogue's sacredness in its non-regular form that went beyond even his own non-orthogonal reflex geometry. As Cohen wrote, quote, other buildings may require Jewish symbols, Star of David, tablets of the law, menorah, to signify them as Jewish. The new Beth Shalom is itself a massive symbol. Unquote. The clearest image of the synagogue's originally intended structural system is an isometric drawing that appears on Wright's working drawings. This isometric is a kind of aerial view from the northwest, and it shows the building's primary structure ordered around 3 center lines on the ground level. These extend between the form's geometric center and its 3 corner bastions. For the skeleton of the dome above, each bastion supports a tripod beam that joins with 2 others in a crowning central roof slab below the outline of a tetrahedral cap. Between each pair of bastions is a chevron beam of reinforced concrete, a long beam so named because of its tapered shape. Together, these form a structural triangle to tie the tripod beams together around their base. In each face of the tetrahedron, 2 tall, nearly vertical window beams, these beams, rise from the chevron beam. Between these vertical window beams and the tripod beams are the nearly horizontal, lateral sloping glass supports, meaning lighter steel beams set like rungs on a ladder to receive enclosing glass. The tetrahedral scheme embodied Wright's dictum that, quote, the most stable of all forms of structure is the tripod. Pressures upon any side are immediately resisted by the other 2, unquote. Not shown are the sloping planes of glass outside of and below the towering tetrahedral dome, these lower planes, whose form Wright changed. Wright chose non-colored white glass for the entire pyramidal roof so that the varied conditions of daylight would create different coloristic effects within the room. In addition to changing color, the translucent glass registers the moving shadows of clouds and taller nearby trees, both outside and inside the building, an effect that has increased as these trees have grown tall. Shadows of flying birds show through the glass dome, accentuating the link to nature. In July 1958, Wright wrote that the interior plastic should, quote, have color as approved pale ivory, unquote, in the spirit of whiteness as a symbol of chasteness in religious life. The translucent corrugated wire glass would be sandblasted on the inside, enhancing its light refracting capacity, making it like prismatic glass serrated on its inner face. For insulation as built, there would be a 5-inch airspace between this outer glass and the inner layer of milky white corrugated wire-reinforced plastic. Aluminum cover strips bind the pieces of glass outside and pieces of plastic inside. The light basket symbolism begins with its being seen against the whiteness of the ceiling glass and the aluminum beams. These surrounding elements were to convey, as the rabbi noted, quote, a chasteness of spirit, which, as Mr. Wright properly said, is one of the great purposes of true religion, unquote. The white sets off the light basket's colors, which signify the mysticism in Judaism, the Kabbalah, whose ideas, as developed in the Zohar, Wright reportedly consulted. Cohen was inspired by the lines of the poet Shelley's Adonais, which the rabbi quoted. Quote, life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity, unquote. Wright's light basket made symbolic sense within the context of the interior space if one knew the tradition of ideas that had inspired the design. Essential to Beth Shalom's architectural and symbolic intent was that the glass dome be illuminated from within at night, as if the whole building were a kind of near tamid, or architectural sacred light, kept burning continually above the ark of the Torah, like a mountain of light. Indeed, decades earlier, Cohen proposed the metaphor of the synagogue as a lighthouse. As Wright said at the groundbreaking, quote, I believe it has been my blessed privilege to embody an expression of the fine, high, burning spirit, the fervor of the Jewish faith. And I think you will find, when you sit in your new edifice, that the Torah not only burns as a living flame, but the flame of Judaism has found real illumination, unquote. As the project neared completion, Wright felt, quote, that outside lighting of the building itself is unnecessary and undesirable, and thinks the main light effect at night should come from the interior lights of the synagogue. Also, as the synagogue would be largely of glass, its night illumination further connoted the interior space as the reality of the architecture, a theme which Wright stressed as a central principle of his church's Sense Unity Temple. As Wright said a few weeks before his death in April 1959, the rabbi, quote, provided me with the ideas and I tried to put them into architectural form, unquote. Much as Reverend Guthrie's text and sketches had inspired Wright's project for the Steel Cathedral 30 plus years before. While rooted in Jewish belief, Wright's Beth Shalom Synagogue was to have broader significance as a crystalline or diamond-like symbol of the ancient revelation of divine law, whose import, originally ancient and tribal, Rabbi Cohen saw as modern and universal, as Guthrie envisioned the Steel Cathedral as a setting for a universal religion. Such ideas echoed Wright's own early formation in a liberal Unitarian tradition, with its emphasis on comparative appreciation of all the world's religions. This likely provided a frame of reference for his work with both Reverend Guthrie and Rabbi Cohen, as well as other clerical clients. In his solutions for all of them, Wright transcended known conventions of religious architecture to create modern symbols that converged on universal principles. Among Frank Lloyd Wright's late public buildings, his Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, was a synthesis of his lifelong interest in circular forms and his interest in the spatial potential of thin shell reinforced concrete domes, then prominent in post-war modernism. But this church also represented his view of how modern architecture could link to Byzantine tradition, the symbolism of which was a priority of his client, the Milwaukee Hellenic community. Contemplated in the fall of 1955, designed before Wright's death in April 1959, and built from May of 1959 to its dedication in July 1961, the Annunciation Church was religious architecture for a denomination with which Wright was less familiar than his wife Olgivana was. The Milwaukee Hellenic community had been incorporated in 1906 as one of the first 10 Greek Orthodox parishes in the United States. Annunciation was marked in the interwar and post-war years by its members' desire to stay connected to events in their Greek homeland. The congregation's Greek name, Evangelismos tis Theotokou, Annunciation of the Mother of God, was a prevalent one among American parishes, partly because the Feast of the Annunciation was observed on March 25th, which since the early 19th century had also been Greek Independence Day. During the Greek Civil War of 1947-48, many Greek Americans identified membership in the Americas branch of the Greek Orthodox Church with the American policy of resistance to a Communist Party takeover in Greece. President Truman flew the Archbishop of North and South America to Istanbul in his presidential plane. There, the Archbishop was enthroned as the ecumenical patriarch, or the leader of the International Greek Orthodox Church. Thus, Wright's architectural allusion to Byzantium was not just an exercise in cultural nostalgia, but also a sign of Annunciation's continuing concern for a modern Greece. In 1958, Annunciation's parish was relatively small, 800 families, and middle class. Greek was often spoken at church meetings and remained one of the liturgical languages into the 1950s, and it's still used in prayers today. Yet it was the more liberal, this congregation, the more liberal and Americanized of the two Greek Orthodox communities in Milwaukee, among 7 then in Wisconsin. Post-war affluence led to rapid suburban migration, and in 1952, Annunciation decided to build a new church on Milwaukee's northwestern outskirts. Wright accepted the commission in January 1956. Annunciation chose him not only because of his fame, but also because of his affinity for Byzantine architecture and the fact that his wife Olgivana had been raised in the Serbian Orthodox Church. With the contract, the church specified the overall program, seating capacities, and liturgical requirements, such as the icon screen. A committee man noted, quote, being of the Eastern Orthodox persuasion, our traditions are exemplified in the Church of St. Sophia in Constantinople and St. Mark's in Venice, which have a cruciform plan, barrel vaults, and domes characterizing the Byzantine style of architecture. The architect for our church is at liberty to design an edifice carrying forth the basic traditions in a modern or organic setting, bearing in mind that a majority of our parishioners are of Greek extraction who have come to America to become a permanent part of the American scene. Unquote. Annunciation's then priest, Father Emmanuel Virgis, suggested a modern dome, quote, to give the effect that we are looking up into the heavens. Unquote. These ideas likely resonated with Wright's earlier admiration for Byzantine architecture, whose origins went back to his apprenticeship with Denkmar Adler and Louis Sullivan. In the late 19th century, Byzantine architecture figured prominently in the writings of Viollet-le-Duc, whom Wright admired, and Auguste Choisy, and other French authorities whose works were represented in Louis Sullivan's library. For these authors, Byzantine forms had Greek as distinct from Roman associations and also conveyed early Christian traditions, as distinct from the Gothic associated with Roman Catholicism and Italian Renaissance dome churches identified with the papacy. In his Con Lectures at Princeton University in 1930, Wright spoke admiringly of Byzantine domes and criticized Michelangelo's St. Peter's. Quote, Stamboul and Hagia Sophia, of course, make St. Peter's look like the scrap pile of reborn posts, pilasters, and moldings of the Greco-Roman sort that it is. Unquote. And of course, not everybody agrees with that assessment. Viollet-le-Duc and others cited Hagia Sophia's low dome supported on pendentives as uniquely Byzantine, distinct from a dome springing from atop a tall drum, as in St. Peter's. Byzantine connoted structural invention, internal stability, grandeur, and simplicity. According to Olga Vanna, Wright asked for advice. Quote, we talked of the Greek Byzantine architectural tradition, obscured through centuries of change. Unquote. Olga Vanna recalled saying, of course you must use the cross. It is the living symbol of the Christian religion. To this, she said, Wright replied, I will build the church with the form of the cross as its foundation. Unquote. The idea of a Greek cross set in a circle appeared in Wright's early drawing, the one on the left, which an apprentice dated to August 1956, showing the plan beneath the elevation of the new church. And this, so far as we know, was his first drawing, and the whole scheme was completely laid out in the very first drawing that he made. The idea of a Greek cross set in a circle is shown in the plan beneath the elevation of the new church, which we're seeing here, and that's roughly the same view as this photograph on the right showing the entrance here. Wright had long worked with circular forms for ornament and architecture, yet for this project he devised an emblematic plan from those forms that signified the specific denomination. Entrance through the oval narthex, symbolically important in the Greek Orthodox faith as the transitional space between the earthly realm of sin and the church within his heaven, is shown here between the west and north piers, with the chancel over to the east. The elevation shows the structure much as it was later realized, with a tiered circular base for the four hollow concrete piers that would serve as the cradle for the upturned bowl of concrete that would form the church's circular balcony. Atop the balcony was a ring of low-arched, clear-story windows, also cast in concrete. Outside the dome, the shallow dome's overhangs are all perforated with semicircular openings that decrease the weight of these eaves and help bring light to the windows, which were later fitted with stained glass. Entrance doors were under a broad low arch between two squared exterior piers, upholding the bowl-like balcony. Inside, beyond the narthex, was an aisle with its sloping floor down to the center of the circular auditorium. Milwaukee is not far from Taliesin, and Wright was able to personally present his design to the congregation in September 1956. He described it as a little St. Sophia that would, quote, bring the romance of the old down to the present. The circle signified, quote, the eternity of God, unquote, encircling a Greek cross signifying Christ as God incarnate. Wright would later design a series of ornaments for the building based on the Greek cross. The circular shape and inscribed Greek cross with its four equal arms, served to distinguish Annunciation from the Roman Catholic tradition of basilican churches with long naves. These had long prevailed among Milwaukee's Catholic churches for immigrant ethnic groups. The reference to Hagia Sophia immediately conveyed religiously specific associations to those whose identification with that tradition would inspire them to sacrifice financially to get the project built. In 1958, Wright wrote, quote, right now I am building churches for the Greek Orthodox and for Christian Scientists and a synagogue for Jews. I built a chapel for a Methodist college, Florida Southern at Lakeland. All forms of religion have a basic desire to function in harmony with their beliefs, and I try to help them to materialize their ideas in something beautiful for all humanity. It's the architect's job. The most outstanding technical feature of Annunciation was its shallow dome, with an internal span of 94 feet, and yet with a rise of only 11 feet. A visitor's encompassed by the dome's visually overwhelming circumference, 333 feet around. Wright explored the option of making the dome as a Guastavino tiled vault, like some of the vaults in Grand Central Station in New York. Yet the dome's size may have made this either technically problematic or prohibitively costly, so the dome as built was a huge reinforced concrete shell poured in a single day to ensure structural cohesion. Around the outer circumference, there was a compression ring of reinforcing. Thermal expansion was accommodated by setting the dome on a circular steel channel beam. So this is a section through the base of the dome here, and I put A to mark where that channel beam is. This beam held about 700,000 ball bearings packed in grease to enable the monolithic concrete dome to move thermally as needed. This channel beam, made in segments whose curvature had to be perfected on site using hand tools, sat on 267 pairs of short vertical steel rods anchored in the circle of concrete below. Between the rods were glass block spheres, which are these spheres here, between the rods, glass block spheres that create a ring of daylight around the dome's base, as a modern analogy to the ring of 40 windows around the base of Hagia Sophia's dome. The circular room with its low, dark dome is intimate. The balcony breaks the scale above the main floor, reducing the room's apparent horizontal diameter. Stanley Stacy, the building committee's chair, said, quote, this looked to me like the dome was the church, and yet it was utilitarian at the same time. When you hear of seating 1,000 people in a church with no pillars to obstruct your vision and nobody sitting more than 60 feet from the sacristy, that impressed me a lot. This is what ecclesia means in Greek, you know. You are part of the group, unquote. Wright created a compact setting for the congregation with mutual visibility, as he had done in earlier churches from Unity Temple on. Annunciation's auditorium, while it has artificial light and wall sconces and light poles, is most powerfully defined by the natural light from the ring of arched windows and the ring of glass spheres that marks the juncture between the walls and the dome. The dome's surface, its crown 40 feet above the floor below, conveys serenity in its relatively dark gilt curvature, in contrast to the peripheral light around the dome's base. The interior's program of liturgical furnishings and decorative art focused on the icons, the paintings of saints set in the frontal screen of metalwork around the altar in the sanctuary behind. In the Orthodox tradition, these images are important for devotional rituals as worshipers kiss them, pray before them, and light candles beneath them. They are unceasing reminders of the invisible company of heaven believed to be present at services. Before he died, Wright designed the icon screen as a visually open wall of metal panels stamped with the cross and circle motif that he had made the ornamental emblem for the whole building. This screen's grillwork permitted worshipers to see into the sanctuary behind, unlike the traditional solid screen that separates priest at the altar from the congregation. After study of Byzantine iconographic art, Wright's assistant, Eugene Masselink, designed and painted the scenes with depictions of Mary, the Christ child, the mature Christ, and 7 scenes from Christ's life. Masselink gave the images on their wood panels vibrant colors of blue and gold associated with orthodoxy and earth tones. These colors pervade the interior, where carpets were yellow and pew cushions deep blue. The dome's plaster was sprayed with gold paint to reflect daylight entering through the clerestory arches around its base. In 1998, Masselink's icons were replaced by more traditional images, and a Greek cross was set atop the dome outside. Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church exemplified how Wright created forms that conveyed religious traditions by alluding to their history. Hagia Sophia was the keynote for both his and his clients' understanding of Greek Orthodoxy, central to collective memory of its origins. Wright's structure is a modern diminutive analog to an Old World model. Such architectural iconography had its parallel in medieval churches, whose forms carried meaning as allusions to major monuments, such as to Old St. Peter's in Rome or to Charlemagne's chapel at Aachen in Germany. It is an approach to symbolism that is largely outside a modernist frame of reference. In his worship rooms from Unity Temple on, Wright sought to characterize congregations. He wrote to the Milwaukee Hellenic community, quote, "The edifice here illustrated is one of a series of sectarian churches I have designed in the past few years, each inspired by what I could feel of the character and beauty of the particular services and faiths of each, and that I have tried to make worthy architecture." This Greek Orthodox edifice, with its Byzantine background as inheritance, seemed particularly delightful as the heritage, St. Sophia at Constantinople, was so close to the nature of great architecture. It is never necessary to cling slavishly to a tradition. The spirit of religion is all that will live, because all that is really significant in life changes and emerges. Wright continued, "The temple of worship for the citizens of Milwaukee of Greek ancestry is conceived in that religious spirit according to changes in life already in sight. The building is therefore not a copy of Byzantine architecture, but better than a copy, it has a proper scale and feeling to reflect the beauty of the architectural heritage and of that ancient period, without copying a single feature. Therefore, this edifice is in itself a complete work of modern art and science, belonging to today, but dedicated to ancient tradition, contributing to tradition instead of living upon it." So to summarize, Annunciation was distant from the mainstream of modernist architecture, whose theory was less concerned with individuality of character, although this concept had been central to the architectural theory of the École des Beaux-Arts. As a student of the École in Paris, Louis Sullivan had advocated buildings that conveyed individual character. He had studied historic prototypes as a basis for his Holy Trinity Orthodox Cathedral in Chicago of 1889 to 1900. Its plan was an octagon set in a square, and its ornament he based partly on Russian provincial churches. Wright later sustained this ideal of architecture as individual characterization of persons in houses or institutions in churches as a principle of his life's work. This helps explain why his later worship halls appear different from each other. Wright was like other mid-century modernists such as Le Corbusier, Alvar Aalto, Jorn Utzon, Oscar Niemeyer, Kenzo Tange, Pietro Belluschi, and Eero Saarinen, all of whom sought vivid symbolic expression in churches. Yet few adopted the historically elusive specificity seen in Annunciation, and Wright's invocation of Byzantine tradition stands conceptually outside most modernist frames of reference. For him, the ideal of organic architecture included characterization as an aspect of functionality, as it had been central to modernist theory for Sullivan. As Wright wrote in 1958, quote, "There seems to be something in the human mind that requires a special particularizing of reverence. That is why we have different religions, each seeking its own relationship with the divine. And it's why we seek different styles in church architecture. Each of his solutions sought the right relationship of modern structure and style to traditions. The central issue that Wright explored, that of appropriately expressive use of new building methods for devotional space, is one that transcends specific denominational and national cultures. It is still a defining question for modern religious architecture, even into the 21st century. Thank you. Thank you. I should tell you, my current book project is on the history of air conditioning. I'm sorry. Yes, I saw two hands go almost simultaneously. Yeah, sure. You're both kindly deferring to each other, right? Okay.
He had a very salacious personal life. Why the churches hired him to do all the church?
Well, it was a difficult personal life, and I think one of the factors is I said he didn't do any churches between Unity Temple and 1938, and the most personally difficult period of his life in those terms was the 19-teens and the 1920s. He had very few commissions generally. So by the time 1938 comes along, he is 70 plus years old. There's a different generation that knows him differently through different cycles of publicity and exhibition. But those 30 years, he didn't have religious clients. And those were the years when this publicity was most damaging along those lines. Yeah, sure. And this gentleman had a question here. Yes.
Do you happen to know what site he had in mind for the Steel Cathedral in New York?
No, I don't. And that's a question that I've asked myself and people have asked me. I don't know. The St. Mark's in the Bowery is way down by, how should I say, Cooper Union. You know, it's way down in the lower part of Manhattan. But I don't know what site was considered. Don't know. There are only a few sketches of it. It's a good question. Yeah. Yes, sure.
Am I imagining the connection between the Great Pyramid of Chichen Itza and the thing about the Evans Park? Is that just...
Well, it's a tetrahedral form. I mean, it's quasi-pyramidal in that sense. No, so far as I know, a pyramid is a four-sided figure, and what he loves is this tripod-like arrangement, which is a three-sided figure, and therefore it's structurally stable from all sides. So that, for him, is distinct from the pyramidal tradition, even though they do all converge with the triangular forms. Yeah. Does that help at all? Or? Yeah.
And I'm sorry,
yes.
a few minutes later.
Sure.
Did you discuss his own personal faith with him?
Did I discuss his own personal?
His own personal faith.
Oh, personal faith. He was a very difficult case. He was someone who, people described him over and over again. Rabbi Cohen described him this way as profoundly spiritual. And someone of Rabbi Cohen's spirituality and stature and learning, for him to have that impression, I thought was quite something. But his family was Unitarian Universalist, and they are, and I'm sure there's a Unitarian Universalist church in New Canaan somewhere, I don't know where it is, but they are on the liberal end of the Protestant spectrum. And there are a number of historical issues that distinguish Unitarian Universalist teaching, but one of the most unusual is that they had from a very early stage a broad appreciation of non-Western religions and other non-Christian religions. So they're the first to kind of own the issue of comparative religious studies. And my favorite example of this is, what is Harvard University's motto today? Veritas. That was not its original motto. Harvard's original motto was Christo et Ecclesia. And it was changed in the early 19th century when the intellectual culture moved to a Unitarian basis. That's right. But that to me signifies this shift into a Unitarian position in the early 19th century, and that's the tradition that Wright comes out of. Does that help at all? Yes, I see a couple of hands. Yeah. Well, I spent the most time thinking about Beth Shalom and working on Beth Shalom. To me, Beth Shalom is, I mean, as you can tell by the time I devoted to it in this talk, it's an extraordinarily moving bill, at least for me. And I'm not Jewish, but I was very taken by it and still feel very attached to it. In terms of a space that I can feel comfortable in, Unity Temple feels very comfortable. And I mean, I grew up in a liberal Protestant tradition, Congregationalist, United Church of Christ, that's still my church. And you feel this liberal denominational culture all around you. I thought, my goodness, I'm feeling it right here. I felt the old meeting house tradition. The hymns have this quasi-secular quality. They don't feel like pilgrim hymnal hymns. And to me, what really struck me is he is able to tap into denominational specificity and to draw out from it an architectural vision. So that's what I respond to. Yeah. And there's a lady behind you who had.
I've traveled to Falling Water and Settler.
Sure.
And I actually was looking at mine in New Jersey. That was one of his designs. I have to say the construction is not of the up. Do you know if any of these buildings have what the problem is?
Oh, they all were very experimental. Sure, they all have their challenges. The thing with Beth Shalom is it has this glass roof, and when they designed the drainage system, it worked to an extent. But the problem was it was so experimental that if there are tall trees all around Beth Shalom, and if you get leaves and tree detritus in that drainage system, it doesn't work. So it had to be redesigned, redone. In Annunciation, the big issue was they didn't initially include air conditioning because they thought it was too expensive. But if you don't include air conditioning, that dome is going to move a lot, and its plaster is going to fall. So air conditioning helps stabilize building materials in an interior environment. So they finally put the air conditioning in, and the dome was okay. But this is right on the edge of what anybody could do. So that's part of its difficulty, yes. Yeah, sure. Yes, hi, sure.
I may be mistaken, but I'm having a recollection that there's a Unitarian church in Westport that Rice did.
I don't know of a Unitarian church in Westport that he designed. I'm not.
Thinking of the Salerno Church in Newington. Joseph Salerno's church.
Okay, maybe one of his associates. Okay, sure. Yeah, sure. Sure, I see a lady's hand there. Yeah.
Can I ask in Annunciation?
Sure.
You said when they did the initial iconography,
Right.
rather than going out and bringing in an iconographer, which is more traditional
Yes.
in the Orthodox Church,
Yes.
why did they go with somebody in Wright's firm who had to go out and study how to do that?
No, that was a major choice, and they ultimately replaced those with more traditional ones. But I think this was the more liberal of the Greek Orthodox churches in Milwaukee. If you go just about a half a mile from this church, you go to the other Greek Orthodox church in this part of Milwaukee, and it has a much more traditional interior.
Could it have been a money issue?
I think this was actually, at the edge of what they could afford. I mean, it was way beyond any norms. And I think they wanted the aesthetic consistency. In other words, they're getting ornamental forms at this scale that are resonant with ornamental forms at that scale. And that was a major issue for Wright, that he wanted this consistency of motifs at different scales. I think that's the spirit of it. And they were okay with that. Yeah. Yes, I see. Does that help? Does that
Can I
help?
say something about the constantly waged charge against Frank Lloyd Wright and leaky roofs?
Right.
No one has ever owned a house for any amount of time that didn't eventually get a leaky roof without one.
Welcome to our house. It was built in 1927. Yes, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I see one more hand. Yeah, sure. Oh, one of them was the David Wright House in Arizona, which has just been restored. And this is a remarkable story. It was about to be torn down. It was purchased by someone who had the means to not only purchase it, but restore it. And now this has been given to the, if I understand it correctly, the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. There was just an article in the Times about it within the last week to help support that school. It has a slightly different name now, but it's basically a continuation of the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. So there are a number of houses that have arc forms or segments of circles. I'm thinking of those as the major examples. There were a number of projects for circular buildings that were not built. The Gamage Auditorium at Arizona State University is quite an impressive auditorium, and that's circular. It has all kinds of circularity at smaller scales. Yeah. Nice building. Nice building. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Just out of curiosity, which whole paintings from the Renaissance that a student did the church at least preserve them or store them?
Oh, yeah, they're still there. They're down. I asked them, well, where are they? They said, oh, they're right downstairs in the chapel. So I went down and looked, and they're still right there. They're now in service in the chapel, which is in the basement of this building. I didn't go into that, but they're still there. You can still see them. Yeah, it's a very nice congregation. Yeah. All of the people that I worked with at these different churches, their archives, everybody, they were very nice. I mean, all over the country. And the synagogue. Yeah, absolutely. No, they were very accommodating, and they put up with my poking around with their materials for a long time. So they were sweet. Kansas City. My wife's from Kansas City, so everybody from Kansas City is great as far as I know. Okay. Well, I think things are quiet. Oh, one last one.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Guggenheim.
Yeah.
At the show in New York,
Yes.
at MoMA, they
Right.
point out that the Guggenheim, the color is
The pink.
evolved from a buff tan, brighter white, with taste. Has this changed color over the years?
The big issue for color was the roof, and it had a tile roof originally, but the tile, because the dome wasn't climatically controlled, the dome was moving, so the tile was moving and splitting. So they had to take the tile off, which is beautifully reflective, and they replaced it with a material called neolon. So it's a matte blue seamless dome, and it's still basically the same blue, but it doesn't have the reflectivity and the vitality that the tile did. So that's the main color issue. Yeah.
But the structure itself was never a buff, say. It was never a tan color as it evolved to more white, which they say the Guggenheim.
No, so far as I know, that this has been consistently in this range, and the Guggenheim's colors, as you know and has been much studied, are an issue that vary. The earlier colors in the Guggenheim were not as bright as they are, white as they are. That's true. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm glad to talk individually to people if you want to still converse. That's great. Thank you. Thank you.